Thunder split the midnight over Chicago as Grace Miller's hatchback skated on rain-slick asphalt, and the city went mute except for her thudding heart. The wheel kicked, glass fountained, and she tasted copper and cold fear. A little boy in a red jacket froze on the median like a lighthouse in human form. A whisper rose inside her chest, not from memory, not from panic. And it said, "Let go." Grace said, "If this is the end, your will, not mine," and the plea steadied her hands. The airbag burst and held her like a rough pillow, while the car settled into a crooked prayer against the barrier. Sirens awakened in the distance and knit the night back together, thread by thread. Her silver locket thumped once against her collarbone as if answering attendance. She saw every bargain she had made with God piled like traffic cones around her pride. Grace said, "I am done negotiating." And the rain softened from assault to blessing. Steam curled from the hood and smelled like burnt plans. The boy ran, safe, and she laughed once, cracked and relieved. "Your will," Grace said again, and meant the words for the first time. Sirens stitched the storm as a paramedic leaned in and made the chaos small. Michael Hart said, "Stay with me," and his voice carried a harbor's weight. Grace said, "I said yes," and he frowned like a man hearing a riddle in the rain. He checked her pulse with hands that did not hurry and did not doubt. The monitor chirped like a bird, arguing with thunder. "Yes to what?" Michael said, and she almost laughed because she had no brochure for surrender. Grace said, "To whatever comes, and to stop pretending I control it." He taped the line and nodded, as if that answer fit into a drawer he knew well. The ambulance rocked, and the city slid past like wet film frames. Grace felt the brittle scaffolding of her plans relax by a notch. "You hit hard," Michael said, "but you're steady." Grace said, "I am held," and realized she believed it. Rain tapped the roof like a metronome for courage. The ER breathed in fluorescent sighs and released them as codes over the intercom. A nurse trimmed glass from Grace's sleeve with calm scissors and kinder eyes. "I have classes Monday," Grace said, and heard how brittle it sounded. The doctor lifted a light and said, "Follow my finger," and she followed, but her soul stared at something larger. She remembered her father's funeral and how she managed casseroles like a general. Grace said, "I called control strength, but it was panic in a suit." The word landed like a pebble in deep water. "You're bruised, not broken," the doctor said, and the verdict felt like mercy. She touched the locket and felt old vows shaking loose. "Your will," she whispered, and the syllables unclenched her jaw. A porter rolled past with fresh sheets that smelled like new chances. Grace signed the discharge forms with steady script and unsteady pride. The storm thinned to a silver drizzle, and hope had a pulse. Her mother arrived smelling of rain and peppermint, a storm front of love in a thrift store coat. Elaine Miller said, "You scared 10 years off me," and tried to scold and pray at once. Grace said, "I'm okay," and felt the statement stand on new legs. Elaine's eyes found the locket and softened into a memory she refused to drown in. "What did you mean by yes?" Elaine said, and the question landed like a key. Grace said, "I let go," and the words sounded like a door finally swinging. The hallway hummed with carts, but a hush gathered around them like shelter. Elaine pressed her forehead to Gracie's and said, "Then I will let go of fear." Their breath cinched as if a choir had taken a note for them. Grace laughed, a small bright sound that rang true. "We walk home," Elaine said. "Or do we float?" Grace said, "We will be carried." The elevator chimed like an amen. Dawn lifted a pale ribbon over the river, and the city smelled rinsed and ready. Discharged, Grace stepped outside with Elaine and felt silence settle like a shawl. Michael walked out, tired and awake, and handed her a card. "Call if you feel dizzy," Michael said, and the words held more care than protocol. Grace said, "Call if I forget." I said yes, and he smiled like a man who had learned the same lesson. Puddles mirrored clouds like open pages. A bus hissed and moved on, uninterested in epiphanies. Elaine said, "Breakfast first, destiny second," and the order felt holy. Grace touched the locket and felt courage click into place like a seatbelt. "Your will," she breathed, and the morning answered with a small warm wind. They walked toward the light with ordinary steps that did not feel ordinary. The storm had not erased the road, it had washed it clear. By afternoon, Grace stepped into Riverside Community School, a brick rectangle wearing hope like chipped paint. Principal Dana Brooks stood beneath a brown ceiling bloom and said, "That leak is a lawsuit waiting to happen." Grace said, "We will fix it," and heard how small the promise sounded. A bucket choir marked the hallway, drip after patient drip keeping time with spelling words. Dana held a clipboard like a shield and added, "Funding is ice thin, and winter is coming fast." Grace felt the yes from the crash hum like a current inside her ribs, quiet and fierce. "Give me a week," Grace said, and Dana raised one brow, unconvinced but willing to be surprised. A boy asked if the rain would cancel reading, and Grace said, "Never," with a smile that steadied him. She saw the school as a living prayer, underfunded, bright, and stubborn. Her phone buzzed with a bill that could not take a joke. She whispered, "Your will," not as abdication but as permission to move without fear. The leak plinked a final beat, and the bell released the room like birds into wet air. At lunch, Grace opened an old lesson binder, and a yellowed envelope slid out like a kept breath. Her name was written in her father's strong slant, a line that used to anchor storms. She touched the paper and felt heat rise behind her eyes, quick as a match. Elaine had saved this, maybe waiting for a day that would not break her daughter. Grace said, "Dad, what did you want to tell me?" And the room seemed to lean closer. She did not open it, not yet, because yes had taught her pace as much as courage. Outside, rain freckled the courtyard and made the trash cans ring like little bells. She placed the letter back in the binder as if tucking in a child. "Andy, show me when," she prayed, and the words landed softer than orders. The clock hands clicked in polite denial of urgency. Her students filed in with lunchbox rumors and bright questions. Grace smiled and said, "Reading first, mysteries later," and meant both lessons. She breathed in the paper's almond dust and felt a season open under her ribs. Maybe answers are gifts that spoil if forced open too soon. She wrote a note on a sticky tab, "When the piece says now," and closed the binder gently. Eric Hale showed up in the staff room, carrying a smile like a business card, and a coffee he did not pay for. "I heard about the crash," Eric said, and his cologne arrived half a beat earlier than his regret. Grace said, "I heard about your new venture," and watched him scan the room for leverage. He said, "Your dad's old lot is just sitting there. You know we could cash out and save this place." The pitch glittered like a shortcut dressed as compassion. Grace felt the tug of convenience and the steadier pull of the vow that had rethreaded her heart. She said, "Selling a seed to buy bread makes sense until spring comes," and Eric blinked, recalculating. He leaned in and whispered, "Investors are hot now. The window will close." Grace saw her students on the other side of a thin wall, spelling hope without knowing it. She said, "I'm not for sale, and neither is that ground." Eric set down his cup too hard and said, "Don't be naive, like a man afraid of slow miracles." Grace smiled, small and real, and said, "I'm learning obedience, not optics." He left with a shrug that tried to look like power and failed. Her hands shook afterward, but her yes held steady like a keel in crosswind. That evening, Grace found Pastor Jonathan Reyes in the church fellowship hall, stacking chairs like liturgy. He poured coffee that tasted like courage, and said that he wanted the part she feared to say aloud. She took a breath, and let the quiet make space for honesty. Grace said, "I can't tell if surrender is wisdom or cowardice." He smiled, lines fanning from eyes that had seen battles won slowly. He said that surrender is not quitting. He added that it is agreeing with the truth sooner. She said, "What if I hide behind holy words and call fear faith?" He answered that God will teach again, by mercy if welcomed, by pressure if resisted. The fluorescent lights hummed, and the room smelled of lemon cleaner and old hymns. Grace felt the steadying weight of being known without being managed. She said, I will be taught, and the promise fit like a key finding its lock. Ray is said to do the next right small thing, and let the needed door be the one that opens. She wrote on a napkin, permits, volunteers, patience, prayer. Outside, mist made the street lamps glow like patient stars. Grace tucked the napkin into her pocket like a map, and stepped into the night. Night returned with its ledgers and a hush that felt like folded wings. Elaine slept in the chair by the window, one hand on a paperback like a god at peace. Grace took the binder and set the letter in her lap as if resting a fragile clock. She broke the seal with a breath and unfolded a map of familiar handwriting. Her father had written years ago, speaking from a place beyond her storms. The first line struck like weather on warm stone. It said that he had asked God to teach her to say yes, even when yes would cost her. Grace whispered that the prayer had found her right on time. Tears rose, hot and grateful, washing the grit off old bargains. She read that the lot was meant for children who might never be chosen first. He urged her to build slow and honest, even if applause never arrived. Grace pressed the paper to her heart and felt history tilt toward purpose. She said that she would not sell a future to fix a present. The house creaked a quiet amen, and the night held steady. She copied a line onto an index card and wrote the date in the corner. She slid the card into her wallet where decisions lived. She prayed that tomorrow would be brave in small steps. Sleep arrived with the soft weight of trust and stayed. Morning rain turned classroom 7 into a drum line, and buckets kept tempo between phonics and fear. Principal Dana Brooks said, "We shut this room until the roof is safe," and her tone left no edges. Parents gathered in the hallway like weather, with legs and opinions. A rumor said mold, another said lawsuits, and both felt hungry. A boy asked, "Does rain cancel reading?" And Grace Miller said, "Never," with a grin that held. Dana said, "I need a plan by Friday," and lifted her clipboard like a gavel. Grace said, "Give me a week," and the word tasted brave and foolish. The yes from the crash thrummed in her chest like a second pulse. Grace said, "Your will," and did not mean passivity, she meant alignment. She wrote calls, permits, volunteers, bake sale, roofers, prayer on a sticky tab. The clock crawled, the buckets plinked, and the bell released the tension like doves. Dana said, "Prove me wrong," and Grace nodded because doubt can be invited to witness. Hope felt small, but it moved, and small hope that moves is a force. On the roof, a contractor in a neon vest traced the leak like a map to profit. Victor Lane said, "Permits are slow unless you grease, then miracles happen fast," and he smiled sideways. Grace said, "I don't buy blessings," and the wind flipped her hair like punctuation. Victor shrugged and said, "Everyone does it," as if corruption were gravity. She felt pride stiffen, and asked it to sit down so integrity could stand. Grace said, "We will wait and work," and the sentence cost her a shortcut. He named a number that sounded like a verdict with fees. She asked for itemized truth, and his grin thinned. Victor said, "Call me when the real world bites," and pocketed his pen like a blade. Grace pressed her palm to the cold tar and said, "Your will," with teeth set. She pictured kids reading under a roof that did not leak in storms. She pictured honesty holding the beams while rain applauded. She left with her yes heavier and cleaner than when she came. At lunch, Michael Hart arrived with a cardboard box labeled supplies and a grin that apologized for sunshine. Michael said, "These are for the infirmary," and set gauze and ice packs like gifts on a table. Grace said, "I keep trying to fix everything," and the words landed gentler than confession. Michael said, "You only need the next right thing," with a shrug that felt like wisdom in jeans. She laughed and said, "You sound like a brochure," and he said, "Pin me to the board." The room smelled of crayons, coffee, and grit that refuses to quit. Grace said, "Next right thing is permits, then volunteers, then prayer again." Michael nodded and did not try to rescue what was not his to carry. He said, "Steady as strong," and tapped the box like a drum beat. Hope rose like steam off a mug left too long. Grace said, "Your will," and the phrase fit her like a jacket finally tailored. The bell rang, and joy slipped in disguised as order. Work waited, but it no longer felt like drowning. Eric Hale returned with a laptop and a tone that sold speed as salvation. Eric said, "Sell the lot, save the school, save your face," and slid glossy slides across laminate. Grace saw charts that rose like promises and hid hooks in the legend. She said, "My face can burn if our kids learn honesty," and his eyebrows climbed. He said, "Investors love decisive leaders," and she heard the flattery hunting a door. Grace said, "I choose obedience over optics," and the room felt larger. Children's drawings of rockets and dogs glowed behind him like witnesses. Eric said, "You will miss the window," and she said, "Windows open for the right reasons." He called her naive and tried to make it sound like a favor. Grace thanked him for caring and returned the slides like fragile dishes. She said, "Your will," and it did not sound weak, it sounded anchored. Eric left with a shrug that rattled like cheap armor, and quiet returned powerful as a tide. That night, Elaine Miller pressed a hand to her chest and gasped like a page torn wrong. Grace said, "Mom," and the word fractured and found resolve in one breath. The ER smelled like bleach and consequence, and tried to be kind. A monitor tapped out a code that meant maybe and mercy. Grace said, "Your will, even here," and felt a keel slide under the panic. Michael Hart stepped in on break and stood near without touching the center. Elaine said, "Do not sell yourself to fear," with a smile that shook. Grace said, "I won't," and her voice surprised her with steadiness. A nurse adjusted the line and said, "We watch and we wait." The waiting felt like a discipline, and also a door. Grace touched the locket and thanked God for breath counted and given. The storm outside quieted, as if night held its own pulse for them. Hope did not shout, but it stayed, and staying can be thunder made gentle. In the quiet hospital corridor, Grace unfolded the last page of her father's letter and found a small map sketched in blue ink. The lot she had inherited was marked with a tiny square and a hand-drawn schoolhouse. Her breath caught, the hallway air thick with disinfectant and destiny. "Dad, you saw this long before I could," she whispered, tracing the pencil lines that still carried his hand's weight. Elaine stirred in her bed behind her, unaware of the future being redrawn in the next room. Grace felt the slow click of purpose locking into place, not as an idea, but as a responsibility she couldn't trade away. She thought of rain leaking into children's books and imagined a roof built by 1,000 small yeses. She whispered, "Your will," with no rush for the how, only certainty for the why. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the map's paper edges curled like it had been waiting for the right grip. Grace folded it gently and slid it into her jacket pocket as if tucking away a heartbeat. Somewhere, a monitor beeped in rhythm with her resolve. At dawn, Grace stood on the overgrown lot, the map folded in her palm like a promise. The morning air carried the smell of damp earth, and last night's rain. Patches of wild grass bent under a steady breeze, whispering possibilities. Michael Hart joined her, coffee in hand, his jacket zipped against the chill. He glanced at the open space and said, "This feels meant." Grace nodded, eyes on the horizon, and answered, "Meant doesn't mean easy." The early sun turned the cracked asphalt gold in strips between weeds. Michael said, "Easy isn't always the goal," and Grace found herself smiling at the truth. Birds darted between the telephone lines, scattering into the widening sky. She could almost hear children's laughter filling the emptiness. Her yes felt lighter here, stretched to match the horizon's reach. She traced her father's schoolhouse drawing in her mind, overlaying it on the field before her. The wind carried away her last doubt, leaving only motion forward. Later that morning, Grace unrolled the map on Principal Dana Brooks' desk. Sunlight caught the penciled lines, making the drawn schoolhouse look almost real. Dana studied it with narrowed eyes, the kind that measured both vision and liability. "If you build here, we'll owe you," Dana said, her voice careful. Grace shook her head. "You'll owe God. I'm just staying out of his way." Donna's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something softer than doubt. The office smelled faintly of coffee and old chalk. Behind them, a shelf sagged under binders labeled "Budgets in Fading, Marker Dot." Grace imagined a new binder one day labeled "Foundation Complete." Dana traced the edge of the map with her fingertip, as if testing its truth. "We'd need permits, volunteers, patience," she said. Grace replied, "And yes." Dana looked up, meeting eyes that didn't flinch, and exhaled like a concession. "Sometimes, partnership begins as surrender." By afternoon, Eric Hale stood outside the school, his frustration bundled into a suit. "You're throwing away money for a fantasy," he said, his breath fogging in the chill. Grace met his gaze and answered, "For an obedience." His eyes narrowed, searching for the old negotiator in her face, but finding only steadiness. The street hummed with passing cars and distant sirens. Eric's voice sharpened. "You can't run a school on sentiment." Grace said, "No, but you can't build one without it." His hand cut the air in a gesture, meant to sever the conversation. She didn't follow it. Eric's shoulders dropped slightly, the fight leaking out like air from a tire. He muttered something about inevitability and walked away, shoes striking the wet pavement in clipped beats. Grace stayed where she was, the locket warm against her collarbone. "Your will," she said quietly, and the words felt like the true conclusion of the meeting. That evening Grace knelt in the small side chapel of the church, the patterned carpet soft under her palms. The stained glass windows glowed with the last fire of sunset, scattering colors over her jacket and hair. The voice she had heard in the crash returned, not as thunder, but as quiet certainty stitched into her breathing. "Do the next right small thing," it said. She exhaled slowly, naming them aloud. Blueprints, meetings, mercy. The list was not a burden, but a sequence of invitations. The air held the faint scent of beeswax and wood polish. Grace closed her eyes and let the warmth settle into her chest. She realized surrender had not shrunk her world, it had added oxygen. Rising, she felt lighter, as if her spine had remembered its purpose. Outside, the evening chill brushed her cheek like a benediction. She stepped into the fading light with the steady gait of someone walking toward a promise. The tea shop opened at dawn with the hiss of milk steaming, and the bell's small mercy. Michael Hart slid into the corner booth with a face that had rehearsed courage. He said, "There is something I should have told you." Grace Miller felt the room tilt from cozy to true. He folded his hands as if they were paperwork he could not lose. Michael said, "I was the medic the night your father died." The words landed like weather on a summer road. Grace's breath stuttered, then found its rhythm again. She touched the silver locket like a punctuation mark. Grace said, "You were there, and let the weight be a bridge, not a blade." Michael said, "I remembered the locket and your voice trying to be brave." He added, "I did all I could, but I feared this would sound like taking." Steam rose between them, threading the gap with ordinary grace. Grace said, "You were present when I learned to surrender." She added, "You are present now." The bell rang for another customer, and the moment chose gentleness over drama. Michael nodded once, eyes bright with relief. He did not spend out loud. Pre-op smelled like soap and second chances, and the clock's hands refused to hurry. Elaine Miller squeezed Grace's fingers with the strength of someone who had already decided peace. Elaine said, "I kept your father's letter because grief had sharp edges." She added, "I waited until paper could heal and not cut." Grace breathed in and felt old arguments loosen their knots. She said, "You did not betray me, you guarded me." The nurse checked lines and winked like a small lantern. A curtain shifted, and the world grew tender around its hinges. Elaine said, "Whatever happens, do not sell your soul to fear." Grace said, "I will not," and was surprised by the steel in her tone. They prayed without fuss, just breath braided to hope. The surgeon entered with eyes that had seen storms and landings. He said, "We are ready," and the room answered by growing still. Grace kissed her mother's forehead, a signature of love and release. The gurney rolled, wheels whispering down a hallway swept of panic. By noon, 3 city officials walked a lot with clipboards like small shields. The sky held a clean blue that made honesty seem practical. Inspector Owen said, "Zoning is possible with phased occupancy," and did not smile. Grace said, "1 classroom, then 2, and let patience do the selling." A gull cried over the river, punctuation for stubborn hope. Another official asked about drainage, and Grace pointed to the plan marked with careful arrows. She said, "We will trench here, then gravel for stability." Michael stood nearby, offering silence that steadied and did not crowd. The youngest inspector said, "You are either naive or unstoppable." Grace said, "Both, possibly," and did not blink. Pens scratched, measuring dreams into lines and signatures. The wind lifted the edges of the map, and then set them down politely. Owen said, "Submit revisions by Friday." And Grace nodded as if he had granted a blessing. She tucked the papers into a folder labeled Faith and Permits, and meant both words. The fundraiser began as a table, a jar, and a dare to hope out loud. Children arrived with coins folded in notebook paper, like tiny offerings. A neighbor rolled up with bricks salvaged from a porch that had outlived its stories. Pastor Reyes said, "God multiplies surrendered small," and his smile made math feel like mercy. Grace stamped donation receipts with a thrifted seal that clicked like applause. Dana Brooks hovered between skepticism and pride, and both were honest. A teen band missed chords and found courage, and the crowd cheered the finding. A mother pressed 2 crumpled bills into the jar and whispered, "For the roof that kept leaking." Grace said, "We will build slow and true," and the words felt like a spine. The jar's clink grew into a rhythm nobody wanted to end. Michael stacked bricks into perfect small towers, and kids copied him with delight. Sunset warmed the posters until they looked like promises already kept. Grace wrote the day's total and underlined it twice, both lines called gratitude. Twilight laid a violet hush over the foundation lines chalked on the lot. The crowd had gone, leaving echoes shaped like laughter and resolve. Grace stood at the center and finally let the old hard tears run honest. She said, "I released the life I planned, and the sky did not argue." She added, "Make me faithful to the one you are giving." Wind carried the scent of wet soil, and something like new pages. The city lights blinked on in a pattern that felt like yes, said many times. Michael waited by the fence, present and not presuming. Grace placed the locket against her heart like a seal on a letter already mailed. She said, "Your will," and the words did not tremble. They landed and held. A train passed with a low hymn that sounded like work becoming worship. She knelt and touched the chalk, promising to trade hurry for honesty. The night accepted the vow and kept it with stars. Grace rose lighter, as if a root had finally chosen its soil. Dawn found the hospital hushed like a chapel with coffee breath. The waiting room clock sang a thin hymn of seconds and vows. Grace Miller rolled prayer beads between fingers, not asking for leverage. She said, "Your will, even if it breaks me," and felt her pulse answer. Michael Hart sat nearby with a thermos in silence that helped. He said, "I'm here," and let the words mean exactly what they meant. A volunteer switched channels from storms to sunrise, and did not ask names. The floor shone with last night's mop, a mirror for nervous shoes. Grace watched doors swallow gurneys and return family with new faces. She held her silver locket like a steady metronome for courage. She said, "I choose trust again now," and the sentence held. The intercom clicked and cleared its throat of codes, Michael said, steady as strong, and tapped 2 fingers on the armrest. Grace breathed like a swimmer who had learned a longer stroke. The hour folded around them, patient as a teacher with kind eyes. The hour stretched until edges formed, and then softened. A red light above the double doors blinked like a practice storm. A nurse hurried past with the gait of someone carrying 3 stories. Grace stood and stood again, rehearsing yes in her bones. She said, "Hold her," and did not specify the method. The surgeon finally came with a tired smile that did not fake. He said, "She is stable," and the room widened like a chest learning air. Grace pressed her forehead to the cool window and said, "Thank you." Michael exhaled a laugh that had been waiting at the threshold. The surgeon named small complications that had become small victories. He said, "Recovery will ask for patience," and nodded once. Grace said, "We have learned patience," and felt it be true. She touched the locket and let relief be quiet and real. The clocks kept time, as if nothing immense had happened. Grace sat again, and let her shoulders drop into peace that stayed. By noon, the lot thrummed with borrowed tools and hopeful noise. Volunteers lifted cinder blocks like sentences, building meaning. Dana Brooks arrived with clipboards and a grin she failed to hide. She said, "It stands if the line holds," and checked the twine with care. Grace walked the chalk edges and blessed them with sturdy boots. Michael mixed mortar and said, "Next right thing," as if it were music. Pastor Reyes prayed short and strong, and the wind carried amen. A teenager learned the rhythm of a level and found pride. The first wall rose awkward and brave, casting thin shade on hot ground. Grace laughed, bright as a bell that knew its note. She said, "It stands," and the words sounded like a promise kept. A breeze lifted dust and braided it with sunlight. Cameras from phones made small archives of faith that looked like work. The wall did not boast, but it held, and holding is a kind of song. 2 weeks later, the ledger showed a gap shaped like doubt with teeth. Suppliers wanted deposits that faith could not print. Grace stared at the numbers until they blurred into parables. Her phone buzzed with a message that smelled like a shortcut. Eric Hale wrote, "Offer stands if we move fast. Terms attached but discreet." She held the screen as if it might stain her palms. Grace said, "Your will," and let the air witness the choice. She deleted the message without a private debate. Michael walked up, dust in his hair, and read her face. He said, "We keep clean hands and a clear roof," and grinned. Grace opened the donation jar and counted humble coins again. Dana set up a second bake sale with a sigh that turned into grit. The wall waited, honest and half-hungry for more bricks. Hope stayed, quieter now, but stubborn as a root under concrete. Friday arrived with signs painted in crayon courage and marker joy. Children lined up like a chorus learning volume. The first banner read, "Thank you, Miss Grace, you taught us yes." Grace covered her face and laughed, ragged and healed. She said, "I am the student," and the kids clapped like experts. Michael stood a careful step away, hands in pockets, proud and quiet. Dana pretended to scold the spelling and wiped her eyes. Pastor Reyes blessed the wall and the hands that lifted it. Elaine, pale but steady, arrived in a scarf the color of dawn. She said, "Look at what faith stacks," and squeezed Grace's arm. The sun struck fresh plaster and made it glow like a promise. Grace said, "This is not mine, this is ours," and the word fit the scene. A breeze fluttered the banners like a living amen. Work returned, but now it felt like celebration with tools. The day closed on faces lit by light, and by hope that chose to stay. Morning light spilled through new windows like a hymn. Banners hung crooked and perfect. Grace Miller said, "Welcome home," and sneakers answered. Elaine Miller walked in slow but upright. "He would be proud," she said, touching the locket. Grace replied, "He taught me the word, and God taught me the meaning." Dana Brooks called attendance with a grin that had surrendered to joy. Pastor Reyes offered a short blessing over chalk, chairs and tempers. Michael Hart stood by the door, present but not needed. The bell rang without startling anyone. Grace breathed, "Your will," and felt the room echo it back. By noon the ledger was full. Dana Brooks said, "We are at capacity," disbelief still on her face. Grace said, "We can add a second shift, if we keep kindness." Dana nodded. Michael stocked the nurse's corner. Elaine sorted donated books. Pastor Reyes arrived with pizzas, calling it liturgy in boxes. Grace wrote patience on the board where objectives live. The day settled into a rhythm that felt both new and old. After classes, the courtyard turned into a chalk sky. Kids drew constellations, wrong and right. "What do stars surrender to?" one boy asked. Grace smiled. "Gravity and God, both hold us in the right place." Michael sketched a crooked moon. Dana Mock wrote tickets for bad astronomy. Elaine clapped from her seat. Pastor Reyes named one, Perseverance. The sky blushed pink. Grace touched her locket, said, "Your will," and the chalk snapped at the period. Dismissal faded to quiet. Michael lingered by the gate. "You kept saying yes," he said. Grace replied, "You kept showing up." Elaine mouthed, "Go slow," toward the sunset. Pastor Reyes locked the side door. "See you at the health workshop," Grace said. The gate clicked shut like a gentle seal. She touched the locket and trusted timing over tension. Blue hour filled the doorway. A small boy tugged Grace's sleeve. "Did God choose you?" She knelt. "I chose to say yes, and God keeps choosing me back." Michael switched off hallway lights, leaving one like a star. Elaine leaned in the frame. Dana carried the ledger past softly. Pastor Reyes stood outside, silent prayer in posture. Grace looked at the wall that learned to stand and whispered, "Your will." The last light held still like a revelation landing.